Hope is like the sun, which as we journey towards it, casts the shadow of our burden behind us. Samuel Smiles. Welcome to Long Haul Hope, a podcast for long haulers, their loved ones, and those who care about them. My name's Joe Grabowski. I'm a husband, a father, a pastor, and a tech geek. I've had lifelong struggles with depression, anxiety, and ADHD, and I've also most recently been diagnosed with long-haul COVID after suffering from shortness of breath, severe fatigue, and brain fog for over 2 years now. Long Haul Hope is not a medical podcast, but a voice of validation, empathy, support, and solidarity. Most of all, it's my desire that this podcast will be a voice of hope in the midst of the darkness of a diagnosis we do not yet fully understand. Each week, I'll share personal updates, positive news developments, advocacy, helpful resources, which I hope will be of value to you in your journey with long COVID. If you felt misunderstood, unheard, devalued, or even been made to feel as though you're a hypochondriac, you've come to the right place. You are not alone. Together we are stronger. There is hope. In the last episode, I shared the first part of my story from getting sick in 2019 to going into 2020 with a rising suspicion that what I'd had back in December wasn't just the flu, it was COVID. That whole year, I read everything I could read about it. I was increasingly convinced that I'd had COVID, but there was no way to test for it. I brought it up with my doctor, but he dismissed it. Instead, it began this journey of trying to get some answers, trying to get some help, and repeatedly being focused back on my weight, my being deconditioned, with advice of get out there and exercise more and lose weight and all those things. But I knew something wasn't right with me because typically in the winter when I get sick, as I talked about last time, I feel better as the spring comes and I'm out and I'm walking and I'm doing some photography and just enjoying being outside and the boost that it gives me. But in 2020, I never bounced back. So I went through that year and I shared that story last time. And then we went into 2021. So now it's been a year. I got my booster in the beginning of 2021. I had the Moderna, both shots. And I was continuing to deal with fatigue, brain fog, and shortness of breath. Now, mind you, these weren't always severe. Sometimes they were barely noticeable, or sometimes it would be one and not the others. But they would come and go. Now, fatigue and brain fog I was familiar with because being diagnosed with ADHD later in life, I always understood what it meant to feel fatigued, I thought, and to have brain fog and not be able to focus and concentrate. But not like this. When this fatigue was like being before I was diagnosed, but on steroids. This fatigue, I described again last episode, I believe, was a deep, soul-crushing feeling that I felt through the entirety of my body, and napping and sleeping would alleviate it. Brain fog, when that would settle in, man, I could not do anything. My brain was just not engaging or working, and that was triggering my anxiety, of course. And then the shortness of breath. That was concerning because that was new. Now, being middle-aged and being obese and being out of shape, there's a certain amount of shortness of breath to be expected. I get that. But this shortness of breath wasn't consistent. Some days it was the normal, like I'm describing. But other days it felt like I had this air hunger, like I could not get enough breath. It was scary. It was disconcerting to get up in the morning and walk down the stairs and have to sit down in the chair to catch my breath. Or to be sitting in my chair for the day resting and still realizing that I'm short of breath. And of course, we didn't know what was going on. I thought perhaps I had long COVID, but nobody really knew anything about it, and there was no way to get tested for that. So I kind of dropped that for a while, but I had periods of having a high heart rate. Now, again, not real terribly high, but even at rest, sometimes averaging over 100, 110. Other times, my resting heart rate's like 60, 70, and the highest it gets in a day is maybe 89. So there were some discrepancies about how my heart operated. And I had this lung burn, and chest discomfort that would arise, and which I associated with being the short of breath. So maybe trying to overcompensate breathing. I'm still not entirely sure. But it was making me nervous because it was discomfort in my chest. It was my lungs burning. Of course, my heart's racing, and then I started checking my O2 levels. And normally, where in the past they've been like 98, 99, they were coming in consistently at like 93, and a number of times dipped into the 80s. Again, not low enough to be an emergency, but enough of a deviation from the norm to be of concern to me. And when I was dealing with these symptoms, those times I'd be dealing with the symptoms, I would have very low or no energy at all to do anything. It felt like work. It took effort. It felt like slogging through mud in the fog and in the twilight and trying to figure out where I'm going and doing while everybody around me can do the regular things. And as I had previously mentioned, I already have a generalized anxiety disorder and a depressive disorder. So, of course, the pandemic, these weird health things were like pouring gasoline on my anxiety, which wasn't helping with my heart rate, of course, and I'm sure my breathing. And then I have these episodes of just feeling depressed, almost empty. Because of my diabetes and my general health, I was seeing my doctor quarterly just to stay on top of my health as best as I could. So I brought these various issues to him, and so I went through a lot of lab work and blood tests and the whole workups. And because of the shortness of breath, he had me, just wanted to rule out any cardiac issues. He referred me to a treadmill stress test, which was okay. And because of the breathing, I ended up having not one but two pulmonary function tests. Was referred to a pulmonologist who then referred me to get a CPET done, a methacholine challenge to rule out asthma. I had a chest CT scan with contrast dye. I had an echocardiogram. I had a stress echocardiogram, which was interesting because I just had to lay there, but they inject this chemical in me that made my heart go up to 170 something. That was fun. And of course, the CPET. In the general consensus of all these things, occasionally it might show some maybe possible abnormality, but then there would be further testing, and then I get the resounding theme: oh, your labs came back normal. Everything looks good. Well, that should be good news, right? That should be really good news. But I spent much of 2021, my wife and I, being scared that something was wrong with my heart. Something was wrong with my lungs. I'm getting to that age where it's not out of the ballpark for things to happen. So my wife would not let me do just about anything because obviously it scared her. So going through these tests, getting the results that everything looks good, everything is fine, it was a relief. It's a relief. My heart's good, my lungs are good, everything's functioning as it should. But then I'm thinking, so why am I feeling unsettled and unhappy? Well, because something was wrong with me. And these tests and procedures didn't really show anything. So the idea of that, okay, so the things we know could be wrong are fine, but something's going on with my body, and if it is long COVID, we know nothing about that. We know nothing at all about it. I've read so many different varying things about it and allowed myself to get scared a little bit. So after all these things I went through, at the beginning of this year, 2022, I finally received a confirmed diagnosis of long haul COVID, where the pulmonologist initially tentatively diagnosed it, and then after the rest of the tests came back fine, it was confirmed. That's what I had, long COVID. So it was great. That was such a great feeling to be taken seriously and to feel heard and validated. And I went back to my doctor, and talked about what she had, and he still didn't accept that. I still wanted to look at different things. He referred me to a rheumatologist, which I have an appointment coming up next month, just at the big hospital to see. And ironically, even though he just would not accept long COVID as a diagnosis, he threw out there, oh, maybe it's chronic fatigue syndrome, which gave me some materials on it, and I read, and I'm like shaking my head because page 3 talks about post-exertional malaise, that for people with chronic fatigue syndrome, the standard get out and exercise is not a good answer because that tends to trigger a crash, tends to exacerbate symptoms. So, but anyway, at that point, I made a decision to switch practices. I had been thinking about it for a while, even before this, but this was the catalyst, and I now knew what it felt like to be heard and validated, and I wanted all these teams and people and reports come together under one who will be able to follow along with it and understand that, yes, I am obese. Yes, I have high blood pressure. Yes, I have high cholesterol. Yes, I have these other factors and had degree of deconditioning, I'm sure. But those were not the thing. The long COVID, as far as I know, is the underlying factor to all these things. And one of the reasons I know that is because I believe if it was true, being out of shape and deconditioning, I think I'd have the shortness of breath all the time, the low energy all the time. I wouldn't be able to physically exert myself, right? But some days I can do normal things just about, and other days I absolutely can't. The day I went to the big hospital to get the CPET done, where I was on an exercise bike for 10 minutes with where they're measuring my respiration and heart rate and everything else, and had me pedal faster and faster, increase the resistance to get my heart rate up as far as they could. I haven't been on an exercise bike in a couple of years. I did it. It wasn't fun, but I made it through those 10 minutes. And the end of that was the CPET looked fine. So I'm still waiting this rheumatologist appointment. My current doctor decided to order a test, an ANA, and it came back positive, and it screens for possible autoimmune disease. So she said, absolutely keep the appointment with the rheumatologist because it's really hard to get people in there right now. So there'll be some more pieces to this, which hopefully will come back the same thing. Oh, everything looks normal. And I also, I've had 3 separate referrals to the long COVID clinic at another hospital. And I finally have an appointment for at least a initial televisit in a couple weeks. So again, some big positive steps forward. So I don't want to spend my podcast every episode talking about myself, but I feel like it's important to share my story because I think other people may be able to relate to parts of it. And that's my hope, is that you hear parts of your story in it, or if you have somebody who has long COVID and you're supporting them, there'll be some elements that resonate with you, like, oh, okay, that explains this. So I'm going to talk about support. Of course, I talked about my wife last episode. My wife has been a huge and consistent support, without whom I don't think I would have continued pursuing answers and self-advocating. The pulmonologist I was referred to was wonderful. She was a expert in her field, and she was also informed on long COVID, and she's in the process of developing a long COVID clinic at her hospital. And she referred me. She was the first referral to the long COVID clinic, and she referred me to the University of Vermont Medical Center's support group, which currently is meeting monthly online. But that was so great because I'd been a part of a Facebook support group, some message boards, some videos, podcasts, and things where people are sharing their stories. And there's a comfort in hearing other people, and they're telling the stories. You hear pieces of your own. And there's a comfort in that because you're feeling like, okay, I'm not alone in this. I'm not alone in what I'm going through. I'm not alone in my feelings. I'm not alone in my fears. Right? But the UVM support group is great because these are people, the majority of them, who live in Vermont or New Hampshire, who are also dealing with long COVID. So it was really refreshing. I've also read many articles which I've saved. I've used a few apps. I regularly utilize some websites. I'm going to share those things in episodes to come. But the recurring theme, even though there's widely varying stories and symptoms, some people, their stories are horrible. They can't even get out of bed. They're in a wheelchair. They couldn't work anymore. They really truly became debilitating. And then there's other people who have it lighter than I do. But I'm probably more towards the milder side. But regardless, the common theme in all these stories is the medical tests and the refrain. Everything looks good. Everything came back normal. So you just, lose weight. Get out and exercise more. It's deconditioning. You're just anxious. Basically, it's in your head. You're a hypochondriac. That's what we get out of it. Maybe that's not what was intended, but that's what we get out of it. So validation is a powerful and important thing. Once you know somebody else gets it, you breathe this sigh of relief. Everything came back normal, so why don't I feel normal? So, which leads me to just a brief piece on advocacy here. I recently got involved with an advocacy group that's working with our representatives in Washington to encourage them to sign on to the long COVID bill that's currently, I don't have the information in front of me, but I'll talk about that another time. But just sharing our stories, sharing the need, and in the process of this, I realized I had some strengths here. I had some advantages. I had decent insurance that covered all these various tests. Any of these tests in themselves are hugely expensive and could bankrupt you. I had a flexibility with my work schedule, so I could go to these appointments, and I didn't have to worry about getting laid off, fired, or losing pay. And I'm a strong self-advocate. I know the value of persevering when you know your body, you know your health, and you're not being heard. I know where it would be easier just to lie down and give up. I know how important it is to continue to advocate for yourself. Advocate, advocate, advocate. We talk a lot in message boards and support groups about medical gaslighting, but yesterday it occurred to me, I think what's happening here is like my body's gaslighting me. My body's gaslighting me because I feel terrible some days. Some days I feel and then I go through these stretches where I feel good, and things are good, and it's going on, and then I start thinking, oh, okay, maybe it's okay, and then nope, the rug gets pulled out from under me. So my own body's gaslighting me and sending me very confused and mixed signals. So the advocacy piece, I had insurance, I have flexibility with work, and it still took 2 years to get the diagnosis. 2 years and all these tests and different medical professionals and telling my story over and over and self-advocating. And what stood out to me as we're preparing to speak with the congressman's office is, what about those people who do not have these things? What about those who don't have insurance? What about those who don't have flexibility with work? So to go get a test done means they're not going to get paid. How long is that going to take them? And then if they don't have the ability to really self-advocate, they go see a doctor about these conditions and their concerns, and they're shut down and told any of these things, they're probably not very likely to go and press on and continue about it. So this is the important piece of advocacy, is what about these people? What about the people out there with long COVID who don't have these? And as we shared with the congressional office, 10 to 30% of people with COVID are going to go on to develop long COVID. That's the current statistics. So I told the congressman's aide, I said, let's throw it out there. It's 300 something million Americans. Let's say only 100 million Americans had COVID. And of those, 10% have long COVID. That's a minimum of 10 million Americans who have or who are going to have the effects of long COVID in the near future. But we all know those numbers are significantly higher. I think at this point we know more people than we don't who have had COVID at least once. And it might be too early for them to tell if the symptoms are persisting. But I said it's a national health crisis about to burst open. So advocacy is important, looking out for those of others, and being a voice for other people who can't speak for themselves. So that's part of what I hope this podcast will do, is also in the sharing of my story today and the last episode, and sharing some other things I'm reading or hearing or using to help manage. I'm hoping to provide some encouragement, some validation, but also to increase awareness and advocacy for the long haulers out there who don't even know they're long haulers. We cannot be silent. We need to make our voices heard. We need to make this condition known and acknowledged for what it is. So, having said that, I'm going to get off my soapbox now. This is the end of my story for now. I'll give an update after I go to the rheumatologist and maybe the long COVID clinic. But as I said, I don't want to spend these podcasts talking about myself. I want to hear from you. I would love to hear your stories. You could write to me at joe@longhaulhope.com. You can visit my website, longhaulhope.com, which is kind of bare bones right now, but you can listen to the podcast there. But you can follow me on Twitter. There's different ways to get in touch with me, but I want to hear your stories. So please write to me. Please drop me an email. Please send me a message. Tell me your story. Tell me your diagnosis, when you got diagnosed, what symptoms you have, what frustrations you have. I want to hear those, not just for myself. I want to be able to share these voices, these messages, with those who have the possible power and position to do something about it. So thank you for joining me today, and I apologize about the delay in putting out this episode. I'd planned to do it last weekend, but life happens. But I'm doing it tonight, and I'm hoping I'm not going to have another big gap between the next episode. This is too important of a conversation to have. So thanks for visiting, and I hope you have a wonderful week and you're blessed. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, share, or leave a rating and a review. And I'd love to hear from you. You can contact me at joe@longhaulhope.com and follow Long Haul Hope on Facebook and on Twitter. And as always, get plenty of rest, be compassionate with yourself, and keep choosing hope. I'll chat with you again soon.